The first time I realized just how cruel people could be, it wasn't from a stranger or a thief in the night. It came from a neighbor. My wife, Anna, had just been diagnosed with breast cancer, and every single day felt like we were fighting not only against a disease but against time itself. The chemo appointments, the constant hospital runs, the endless medicines, it was all overwhelming. Yet what kept her strong was the quiet promise I whispered to her every night. "I'll make sure you get through this, no matter what it takes." She would smile faintly, her once bright eyes dimmed with exhaustion, but still filled with love. And then one day, just when I thought we had enough battles already, Karen stepped into our lives with her poisonous sense of control. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the president of the HOA, the self-appointed queen of our small community. She strutted around as though she owned the streets, barking orders at people about lawn heights and mailbox colors. Everyone feared her temper. But I had always ignored her petty rules, focusing only on keeping Anna comfortable. That mistake, that belief that ignoring her would keep us safe, nearly cost my wife her life. It started one morning when Anna and I were loading into the car. Her skin was pale, her scarf neatly tied around her thinning hair. I could see how tired she was, but she was ready for treatment. She needed it. Suddenly, Karen marched across the street, holding her clipboard like it was a weapon. "Excuse me," she snapped, blocking the path of our car. "You can't keep parking your car overnight in the driveway. It's against HOA policy." I blinked at her, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Karen, my wife has cancer. We need quick access to the car. She can't walk far from the garage." I tried to keep my voice calm, but Anna's hand on my arm trembled, and I knew she was feeling humiliated just hearing her illness used as an excuse. Karen's lips curled into a fake, sympathetic smile, the kind that made your stomach turn. "I'm sorry about your wife, really I am, but rules are rules. If you keep violating them, I'll have no choice but to escalate this. Treatments or not, the community comes first." For a second, I thought I had misheard her, that this was some kind of nightmare, but she meant it. In her twisted world, an HOA violation mattered more than a woman's fight for her life. I wanted to scream, to throw her off my driveway, but Anna squeezed my hand softly and whispered, "Let's just go. Don't waste your energy on her." So I swallowed the anger burning inside me and drove away. But the rage didn't die, it grew. A week later, things got worse. When we arrived at the hospital, the receptionist looked at me nervously and said, "Mr. Carter, we received a call from your HOA board. They claim there's a zoning issue with your property that disqualifies your medical transportation privileges. Until that's cleared, the treatment schedule is under review." I felt my chest tighten as though someone had slammed a brick against it. "Under review? You can't be serious. My wife needs this treatment to live." I could see Anna trying to keep calm, though her lips trembled. She looked down at the floor, tears forming in her eyes, ashamed that her illness had become a pawn in some ridiculous neighborhood power struggle. It didn't take me long to figure out who had made that call. Karen. She had taken her pettiness beyond the neighborhood and into our survival, and at that moment something inside me snapped. She thought she was untouchable because people feared her, because she had the HOA wrapped around her finger. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the hospital Anna was receiving treatment in belonged to me. For years, I had kept my position low-key. I wanted Anna to have a normal life, wanted our marriage to feel grounded despite the fortune I had built. So while people in the neighborhood saw me as just another resident, another husband with a mid-sized car and quiet family, the truth was far different. I was the owner of the very hospital she had dared to meddle with, and she had just declared war in a battlefield where I held every weapon. I didn't tell Anna immediately. She already had too much on her shoulders, but inside me a storm was forming. Every time I watched her shiver from chemo side effects, every time I saw her wipe away tears in silence, I remembered Karen's smug face. She thought she could dictate where and when my wife fought for her life. She thought her clipboard gave her power over us. She had no idea she had just awakened a man who would burn her little empire to the ground for crossing that line. The next day, I walked into the hospital boardroom. "From today," I told the administrators, "no HOA interference, no third-party calls, no outside complaints are to be entertained when it comes to patient care, especially my wife. Anyone who even entertains these calls will answer directly to me." The staff nodded, relief on their faces. They had been uncomfortable, caught between policies and humanity. Now they had clear instructions, but I wasn't finished, not even close. Karen had made this personal, and if she wanted to play games with power, I would show her what real power looked like. That night back at home, I watched from the window as Karen strutted around with her flashlight, inspecting lawns as if she were a soldier patrolling enemy territory. My fists clenched. Anna was sleeping upstairs, exhausted from her treatment, unaware of the fire burning inside me. But I made myself a promise in that dark silence. Karen was going to pay, not just for the stress she caused my wife, not just for the humiliation. She was going to pay because no one messes with my family and walks away unscathed. And as much as I hated to admit it, part of me wanted her to keep pushing. Because the further she went, the harder she would fall. And when I was done, Karen wouldn't just lose her clipboard or her HOA title. She would lose everything she used to control others, everything she ever valued. The days after I ordered the hospital to ignore Karen's calls were a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because at least Anna's treatments were back on schedule. Dread because I knew Karen wouldn't stop. People like her don't admit defeat. They escalate. They gather witnesses, they whisper into phones, they build grudges like fortresses. I kept expecting another petty letter or a threatening email. What I didn't expect was how she would try to hurt Anna in the one place she thought would never be touched, our dignity. Anna tried to be brave. She smiled through the moments when chemo took the color from her cheeks and made her hands tremble. She kept a small garden of potted herbs by the kitchen window, tending them with gloves when she could. "They remind me life still grows," she would say, and I believed her. But I could see how each new thing Karen did dug a little deeper into her peace. The woman who'd picket a mailbox now turned her spite into something more calculated and cruel. It came in small, cutting ways. A neighbor I'd spoken to my whole life stopped by one afternoon, guilt shading his expression. "They found old paperwork," he said, lowering his voice. "Karen's been going through county records. She's convinced she can force a lien on your property. Says you're hiding something. People are talking." I felt my throat tight. The last thing Anna needed was a rumor mill or the neighborhood whispering that our house, our home where she fought most of her battles, was under legal threat. I should have confronted Karen publicly, should have dragged her into the light and made her explain herself. But I wanted more than a public argument. I wanted a lesson that would cut into the center of her arrogance and make sure she could never hurt another family like that. So I began to prepare, quietly, carefully. I studied the HOA's bylaws the way a general studies a map of enemy territory. I combed through the community's minutes, the chain of signatures, the snail trails of petty complaints that had somehow formed into power for one woman. There were mistakes, small, sloppy errors that only someone with patience, resources, and a cold heart would have overlooked. Errors I could use. While I planned, Anna healed as best she could. The chemo did its ruthless work, and then with days of nausea and nights of insomnia, a small reprieve. She grew stronger, if only in increments. I watched her walk a little farther, held her while she cried into my shirt at night, and fed her soup that I tried to make seem as though it would fix everything. I told myself revenge was not for me alone. It was a shield for Anna so she wouldn't wake to another phone call or another person's belief that their rule mattered more than her life. One evening, as autumn pressed its chill into the neighborhood, Anna and I sat at the kitchen table. Her hands were thinner now, but she held my fingers like an anchor. "Have you thought about selling the hospital?" she asked out of nowhere, looking at the window and the street where lights blinked one by one. Her voice was soft, uncertain. I knew she was thinking of ways to make our life simpler, of taking weight off my shoulders. That's who she was, always the one to carry less. "No," I said without hesitation. "This isn't about money, Anna. It's about people like her not getting to decide who lives and who dies. It's about making sure nobody else has to fight the way you did because some woman wanted to feel important." She looked at me then, eyes wet but steady. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. "I don't want you to become someone else." Her words struck deeper than any legal maneuver. I promised her. I promised I would be careful, that I would stop the woman who had weaponized rules without becoming cold in the process. That promise was a tether. I was determined not to drown myself in bitterness. The first move in my plan was simple: transparency. If Karen thrived on hidden rules and whispered threats, then I would shine a light on the whole operation. I started by calling in favors. Old colleagues, lawyers I'd helped years ago, a journalist friend who owed me a favor for a story about hospital fundraising. They all understood without much explanation. Abuse of HOA power wasn't news by itself, but when you showed how one person used the facade of civic duty to ruin families, it became a story that people cared about. We compiled evidence. The HOA's own meeting minutes showing a pattern of targeting, records of fines that didn't match the bylaws, a list of residents who had signed off on rules they hadn't read because Karen had simply told them to. I watched from the edges as our community simmered. A meeting was called, and Karen, smug as ever, prepared to defend her stance. She wore the same neat blouse, the same posture that suggested she was born to lead. People gathered, some out of curiosity, some of them suffering from the same quiet resentments I'd seen. My lawyer friend presented a packet of documents. He spoke plainly about wrongful fines, misfiled notices, and a pattern of harassment aimed at certain families. Corinne's face, once carved in certainty, shifted. Her hands clenched around her clipboard. She didn't like the light. She had worked so hard in the dark. She lashed out with what she always had, insults, accusations, the kind of theatrical outrage that made some people sympathize with her. "I'm protecting our neighborhood," she cried. "I'm keeping property value safe." But the evidence was hard. It showed names where there should be none, anonymous complaints filed from PO boxes, and signatures that looked suspiciously like someone had coached them. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about money or the hospital. I told the room a simple truth. There are rules for a reason, but rules are not an excuse to hurt people. My wife nearly lost her treatment because someone wanted to feel powerful. If that stays acceptable, we're all less than we were yesterday. The silence that followed felt like an avalanche. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. Some of them remembered their own small humiliations at Corinne's hands. Others had silently agreed with her out of fear. Now they had to choose. The vote to remove her from the HOA board was not a theatrical rupture. It was a slow, sober acknowledgement. Enough of the community had had enough. Corinne's protests grew shrill, but in the end, the measure passed. She left that night with the same clipped shoes, but without the crown she'd always worn. She churned in the neighborhood for a few days, making small attempts to claw her way back, complaints filed, emails sent with legal-sounding language, but the momentum had shifted. The officers who had supported her began to distance themselves. When a woman loses a title that feeds her identity, she seeks other ways to hurt. Corinne started targeting people with gossip and petty actions that were easier to discredit now that the HOA had seceded its power from her fist. Despite the win, I knew this was only the start. Corinne would not give up easily. She had time, and spite is a thing that grows in the quiet. But for the first time since she had blocked our driveway, I felt a small, fragile relief. The hospital kept its distance from neighborhood politics, Anna's treatments continued, and our home found a pause in the storm. That night, as Anna slept with her hand in mine, I felt the promise I'd made settle into my bones. There would be more to do. There would be more fights. But the first wave had broken against the shore, and for now, the tide had turned in our favor. Corinne's silence didn't last long. I should have known it wouldn't. People like her, people who thrive on domination, don't just walk away when you strip their title. They linger like a shadow in the corner of a room, watching, waiting for the next chance to strike. At first, it was petty. She left anonymous letters in people's mailboxes, claiming I was abusing privilege to manipulate the HOA vote. A neighbor who had once smiled at me began avoiding eye contact at the grocery store. A few whispered words from Corinne, and suddenly doubt spread like mold through the cracks of our community. But I ignored her. Anna came first. She had just started another cycle of chemo, and it left her so weak that even brushing her hair was too much. I would sit by the bathroom door, listening to her gag and choke, helpless as her body tried to reject the poison meant to save her. When she stumbled back into bed, she would smile, God, that smile, and whisper, "I'm okay, don't worry." But I worried. I worried about her every second of the day. I worried about what Corinne's venom was doing to her spirit. One afternoon, while Anna napped, I stepped outside to water the herbs she loved. The air was crisp, autumn leaves curling along the driveway. That's when I noticed something nailed to our front door. A notice, bold, red lettering stamped across the top. "Cease and desist." My heart dropped as I read the words. Corinne had filed an official complaint with the county zoning board, claiming our house was in violation of community medical transportation use. It was the same nonsense she had tried before, now escalated to a higher level. The letter threatened fines, possible legal action, even foreclosure if the complaint wasn't resolved. I tore the paper down, my hands shaking with rage. It wasn't just an attack on me, it was a direct assault on Anna's stability. She needed to feel safe at home, to believe the world wasn't collapsing around her. This wasn't a fight about driveways or bylaws anymore. Corinne wanted to poison every ounce of peace left in Anna's life, and I couldn't allow it. That evening, I didn't tell Anna. She had enough weight pressing on her chest. Instead, I sat in my study long after midnight, the glow of my desk lamp illuminating stacks of files. I began piecing together every shred of evidence I had on Corinne, not just the HOA mismanagement, not just the rumors, real, tangible proof of her abuse of power. I had the resources, the lawyers, the contacts. And I wasn't just going to fight her complaint. I was going to bury her in the truth she had spent years hiding. The more I dug, the darker it became. There were misused HOA funds, money collected from residents supposedly for community repairs that had somehow been funneled into Corinne's personal projects. Landscaping invoices for work never done. A playground repair that never happened, yet the bank statements showed thousands withdrawn. She had turned her position into her personal bank account, and she thought no one would ever look. I stared at the documents, each page feeding the fire inside me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was justice. Justice for every family she had bullied, every parent she had humiliated, every child who watched their parents wilt under her arrogance. 2 weeks later, the zoning board hearing was scheduled. Corinne arrived in her usual armor, a pressed blazer, hair pulled so tight it seemed to stretch her face, that smug smile pasted on her lips. She carried a stack of papers, ready to prove we were breaking the rules. But when my lawyer began presenting our evidence, her smile cracked. One by one, the invoices, the bank records, the signed checks in her name, all of it displayed on the projector. Gasps rippled through the small courtroom. Corinne's eyes darted, her voice faltered when she tried to object. The judge's face hardened. This wasn't the picture of a concerned citizen protecting her neighborhood. This was the portrait of a fraud. After the hearing, when the ruling came in our favor and Corinne's complaint was dismissed as baseless, I felt a rush of triumph, but also a strange hollowness. Because when I stepped outside, Anna was there waiting. She had insisted on coming, even though she was weak. She looked so small in her scarf and oversized coat, but her eyes glistened with pride. She squeezed my hand. "You did it," she whispered. "You fought for us." And in that moment, I realized the revenge I wanted wasn't about destroying Corinne. It was about protecting Anna. Every battle I waged was for her smile, her peace, her healing. But Corinne wasn't finished. She stood across the parking lot, face flushed with fury, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "This isn't over," she hissed, loud enough for us to hear. "You think you've won, but I'll take everything from you, everything." Her words cut through the autumn air, sharp and bitter. Anna stiffened beside me and I pulled her close. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "She's already lost, she just doesn't know it yet." That night, as Anna rested, I sat awake, staring at the ceiling. Corinne's threat echoed in my head. She wanted war, but she didn't realize she had stepped into an arena where I held the ground, the weapons, and the will. I wasn't just a husband fighting for his wife anymore. I was a man who had built an empire in silence, and now I would use every ounce of it to crush the tyrant who dared to think she could dictate whether my wife lived or died. In the days that followed, I set the next stage in motion. I contacted the district attorney's office, sharing the evidence of HOA fund misuse. I reached out to residents quietly, letting them know their money had been stolen, their trust abused. Fear began to shift into anger. People whispered not about me now, but about Corinne. Neighbors who once avoided me began stopping by, offering hesitant smiles, quiet words of support. The tide was turning and Corinne's kingdom was crumbling. But I knew her well enough to understand that the more cornered she felt, the more dangerous she would become. And deep down, a gnawing fear haunted me. She wasn't finished with Anna. She had tried to strip away her treatments once. She had tried to attack our home. What would she try next? That question burned in my chest like a warning bell. And though I didn't know it yet, the answer was coming faster than I could imagine. An answer that would push me to the edge of who I thought I was and force me to unleash the part of myself I had sworn to keep buried. The fallout after the hearing should have been the end of it. It should have been a quiet time where Anna could recover, where we could inhale for the first time in months without feeling like someone was watching. But Corinne was not a woman who accepted endings. She needed an audience. When she couldn't win in the courtroom, she decided to win in the court of public opinion, and she aimed the story at the one thing she knew would hurt me the most: Anna. It started with a small article on a local blog, an angry, sloppy write-up that claimed our hospital gave preferential treatment to wealthy families and that my wife's rounds were a staged show to win sympathy. The piece quoted an anonymous, concerned neighbor and used vague language that invited suspicion. It was the kind of thing that spreads not because it's true, but because people like to watch the powerful fall. My stomach dropped when a nurse texted me a screenshot and Anna's face went the color of ash. Her hands trembled. "They'll believe anything," she said, and she tried to laugh, but it sounded hollow. I called our PR team and lawyers immediately. We had built a careful reputation for the hospital, years of community outreach, a staff that believed in patient care. But reputations are fragile when someone with a loud voice and a grudge decides to scream. I wanted to respond with proof, with calm facts, not with anger. But it hurt to see Anna's spirit bruised by lies while she was already so weak. I held her that night and promised that I would not let a vindictive rumor steal her dignity. Karen's campaign escalated. She started showing up at community events, handing out photocopies of the article, whispering to neighbors that we had a conflict of interest. She emailed local reporters, calling me arrogant and above the law. She posted on social media, tagging local advocacy groups, accusing the hospital of paying for silence. Each move was designed to look small and casual, just another concerned citizen asking questions, but the pattern stitched together into a narrative meant to poison minds. What cut the deepest was how quickly it began to affect the staff. Nurses who had been with us for decades started avoiding certain conversations. Volunteers canceled shifts, citing scheduling conflicts. A few older residents who had once donated to our community health drives called to ask if everything in the hospital was above board. I could see the uncertainty ripple through our halls. The last thing I wanted was for Anna's care to become collateral damage in Karen's vendetta. I called a press conference. I stood at the podium and spoke plainly about the hospital's policies, our ethics, and the audits that proved transparency. I showed the numbers: patient intake, charity care, outcomes. I made sure the reporters heard how Anna's treatment was scheduled and approved through the standard channels, with every step logged and every decision documented. Some of the reporters nodded, others scribbled, but there was something else I could see: Karen watching from the back with a face that had the thin sheen of panic. Even with the press, I knew we were fighting on two fronts: the public narrative and the small, private cruelties that Karen used to unsettle people. She shifted tactics, using proximity as her weapon. She began to watch Anna's house again, not in the official HOA fashion, but in a manner that felt personal and invasive. She'd stand across the street during treatments, pretending to be checking on the neighborhood, eyes hidden by sunglasses even in late afternoon. She laughed too loud at events where my family sat quietly. It was simpler warfare, psychological, and it wore on us. One night I found Anna curled up on the couch, a blanket over her knees, staring at her phone. She had been scrolling through comments under the article. Trolls said cruel things that had nothing to do with truth. Some accused her of playing sick to get sympathy. Others wondered why the hospital didn't treat real people first. I sat down beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me, chin on my chest, and cried softly. "I thought people would see past her lies," she whispered. "I thought this would stop." I felt powerless in that moment, which was a feeling I hated. Power had been my tool for years: money, influence, and ability to protect the ones I loved. But Karen had found a new way to use the world against us. I realized then that I could not only use institutions and lawyers anymore. I needed the truth to be louder than her lies. I needed people who would listen because they cared, not because I could buy their attention. So I called in favors again, but this time it wasn't lawyers alone. It was the volunteer coordinator who'd grown up in our town, the pastor who had seen Karen's fury firsthand, the longtime nurse who had held Anna's hand through 2 surgeries. We started a grassroots response. Stories began to circulate, quiet, human recollections of the hospital's good work. A woman whose child had been saved by a midnight surgery wrote a public letter. A retired teacher recounted how our community programs helped her neighbors. The tide shifted, but it felt fragile, as though at any moment Karen could push again and the swell of goodwill would scatter. Then came the night that forced everything into the open. At 2 a.m., the hospital's security system pinged my phone. Someone had attempted to access patient records from a terminal in the administrative wing. The images from the cameras showed a figure in a dark coat moving with purpose through the corridor, an object in their hand that looked suspiciously like a keycard. They tried 3 terminals before the alarm system locked them out. The footage saved the moment they turned toward the camera, an old woman with a face I knew too well. Karen's eyes were wide, and for a second her composure fractured into something raw. She dropped a small stack of papers on a desk before the building locked down, and she fled into the night. I watched the playback in stunned silence. My hands were shaking. She had broken into the hospital. She had tried to plant something in our system, something that would be found later and used to prove wrongdoing. She wanted to fabricate evidence to match her lies. In that instant, anger that had been slow burning turned into ice-hot clarity. This wasn't about titles or pride anymore. This was an attempt to sabotage lives. I called the police. I walked the halls at dawn with the security head replaying the footage for him. The footage stopped Karen's story cold. The detective took notes, his face grim. Karen had moved from smear campaigns into criminal territory. The law would not tolerate that. The relief that coursed through me was tempered by dread that she could hurt Anna again, and dread that the legal process would make my family relive these attacks publicly. The next morning, when I told Anna what had happened, she gripped my hand and wept, not from fear, but from a release I hadn't expected. "I can't do this anymore," she said, tears tracing lines down her face. "I don't want to be in a war." I pressed my forehead to hers. "Then let me fight," I said. "Let me finish this so you can rest." She looked at me exhausted and brave. "Promise me you'll come back to me the same man," she whispered. "I need you." The plea landed like a bell in my chest. Through everything, through the fury and the legal battles, I had to hold on to who I was. I could not let the battles strip away my kindness or make me someone Anna would not recognize. But even as I vowed that to her, I felt the world narrowing to a single point. Stop Karen. No more lies, no more break-ins. End this and end it clean. I had the evidence, the allies, and now, thank God, the law on our side. Yet there was still one problem that haunted me. Karen had friends. She had a web, and wherever there is a web, there are more flies to untangle. That afternoon, the detective called me back. He said they had a lead on where Karen might have gone after the break-in. They had found partial prints on the clipboard she'd left behind. It wasn't a certainty, but it was something. "If she goes down," the detective said quietly, "it'll be because people knew the truth." I nodded, though my throat felt thick. People knew the truth, some already did, and soon more would. But the fight was far from over. The night after my mother's court appearance, the house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. Every corner carried the weight of unspoken words. Every room hummed with grief and exhaustion. My niece Emma had locked herself in her room again, headphones on, trying to drown the world out. My sister sat silently on the porch swing, staring out into the street where porch lights glowed like silent sentinels. I watched her through the window, and my chest ached at the sight. Her once lively spirit now dimmed by the cruelty she had endured at the hands of people who were supposed to be neighbors, not tormentors. But beneath the silence, something else was growing, not just hurt, not just sadness. A quiet storm was forming inside all of us. We had suffered enough. That realization hit me like a jolt. For weeks, the HOA had dictated every move we made, turned our family into their target, mocked our pain, and humiliated us in public. But what they hadn't counted on was that grief can harden into resolve, and that once a family is pushed to the brink, there's no going back. The turning point came when Emma finally emerged from her room, tears streaking her face, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. "I don't want to live here anymore," she whispered, her voice so fragile it made my heart break all over again. "I can't even walk outside without them laughing at me. I feel like I'm drowning every day." My sister pulled her into her arms, sobbing quietly as she stroked her hair. I stood frozen, my fists clenched at my sides, rage boiling in me so fiercely I could hardly breathe. Watching that child suffer for sins she never committed, watching her youth robbed by adults who should have known better, was the last straw. That night I couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the pile of HOA letters spread across the table like scars on paper. Each one represented an attack, a wound, an insult to our family's dignity. I picked one up and read it again. "Failure to comply will result in further fines and legal action." The arrogance, the coldness, the sheer cruelty in those words lit a fire in me I could no longer contain. I swore then that this wouldn't end with us on our knees. It would end with them exposed, stripped of the power they had abused for far too long. The next morning, I gathered my mother, my sister, and Emma around the kitchen table. My voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of conviction. "They want us to break. They want us to disappear quietly, but we're not going to. We're going to fight back, and this time we're going to make sure they never do this to anyone else again." My mother's eyes widened slightly, fear and hope warring inside her. My sister wiped her tears and nodded slowly, her jaw tightening. Emma said nothing, but the faint spark in her eyes told me she wanted it too. So we started planning, not with anger alone, but with precision. I began collecting every letter, every recorded interaction, every photo of their harassment, every shred of evidence that showed how far they had crossed the line. We compiled witness accounts, neighbors who had suffered in silence, too scared to speak until now. And slowly, piece by piece, we built a case that was stronger than anything the HOA could manufacture with their lies. At first, my mother was hesitant. "They have lawyers, they have money, they'll crush us," she whispered one night as we worked, but I shook my head. "What they don't have is truth. What they don't have is a family that refuses to stay silent anymore." And for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of determination in her eyes. But it wasn't just about the legal fight. I wanted them to feel what we had felt, the humiliation, the fear, the shame. So while I worked on the evidence, I also reached out to local reporters. I told them about Emma, about the bullying, about the HOA president's cruel outburst in the courtroom. And when one journalist agreed to meet us, I knew we had opened the door to something bigger. The article hit the local paper 2 weeks later. Family claims harassment by HOA after tragic loss. Emma's face wasn't shown, but the story painted the reality of what we had endured. Overnight, our quiet suffering turned into a community discussion. People started asking questions. Some neighbors approached us with support, whispering apologies for not standing up sooner. The HOA tried to dismiss it as exaggeration, but the seed of doubt had already been planted, and their perfect image was beginning to crack. The president of the HOA, Karen, stormed to our house the day after the article was published, her face red with fury. "You think you can drag my name through the mud?" she snapped, pointing her finger in my mother's face. "You'll regret this." I stepped forward, my voice calm but sharp as glass. "No, Karen, for once you're the one who's going to regret what you've done." Her eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something else there too, uncertainty. For the first time, she wasn't in full control. And as I watched her storm away, I realized something. The tide was finally turning. The pain they had caused us wasn't going to destroy us. It was going to become the very weapon that brought them down. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, and justice was only just beginning. The morning of the hearing arrived like a storm cloud hanging low over the neighborhood. Weeks of preparation, sleepless nights, and quiet tears had all led to this day. My mother, dressed in a modest dark suit, clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. My sister held Emma's hand, her lips moving in silent prayers. I walked beside them, carrying the folder stuffed with evidence we had gathered: letters, photos, recordings, witness statements. Every page was a fragment of our pain, now turned into ammunition. When we entered the courthouse, the air felt heavy, electric with tension. The HOA board was already there, seated together like vultures in expensive suits. At their center sat Karen, the president, her smug smile radiating confidence. She believed she had already won. She believed we were too small, too broken to stand against her. But as I looked at my family, I realized something powerful: we weren't broken. We were scarred, yes, but scars don't mean weakness. Scars mean survival, and survival meant strength. The hearing began with the HOA's lawyer rattling off claims of noncompliance, disturbance of community standards, and failure to maintain property. They made us sound like criminals in our own home. Karen nodded along, her chin lifted high, her eyes occasionally flicking to us with thinly veiled contempt. Emma squeezed my hand under the table, her small fingers trembling. Then it was our turn. My mother rose first. Her voice was soft, but each word carried the weight of truth. She spoke of the harassment, the fines, the cruelty. She described how the HOA mocked our grief, how they turned Emma's pain into a weapon. At first, her voice cracked, but as she continued, something remarkable happened. She grew stronger. Her sorrow transformed into resolve. The courtroom grew still, every ear straining to hear her trembling but powerful words. When she finished, it was my turn. I stood, unfolding the folder, my hands steady. One by one, I laid out the evidence. The letters threatening us with fines over trivial nonsense. The recordings of HOA members shouting insults. Photos of Emma sitting alone after being ridiculed by adults who should have protected her. Each piece landed like a hammer blow against the HOA's facade. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his confident rhythm breaking. Then came the witnesses. One by one, neighbors who had once stayed silent finally spoke. A woman described how she was fined for painting her shutters the wrong shade of blue. An elderly man testified that he had been threatened with eviction after his wife's wheelchair ramp was deemed unsightly. Their voices joined ours, painting a picture not of a family in defiance, but of a community held hostage by power-hungry tyrants. By the time it was Emma's turn, the room was thick with emotion. She was nervous, her voice quiet, but when she spoke, the entire courthouse leaned in. She told them how the HOA made her feel unsafe, how she dreaded walking outside, how she had begged to leave the home she once loved. Her eyes glistened with tears, her voice cracking as she whispered, "They made me feel like I didn't belong anywhere." Silence followed. Even Karen shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering just slightly. And then came the moment I'll never forget. The judge leaned forward, his voice calm but stern. "I've seen HOAs misuse their authority before, but this is something else. What I see here is a pattern of abuse, harassment, and exploitation." He paused, his gaze locking on Karen. "This board has forgotten its purpose. Instead of serving the community, you've terrorized it." Karen's face flushed crimson, her lips parting as if to protest, but no words came. For once, she had nothing to say. The ruling was swift. The fines against us were dismissed. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for emotional distress and harassment. And most importantly, the board itself would face an internal review with the possibility of removal for misconduct. It should have felt like victory, and in many ways it did. But what made it truly powerful wasn't the legal win, it was the look in Emma's eyes as we walked out of the courthouse. For the first time in months, she wasn't just surviving, she was breathing, she was free. Yet deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Because while the law had dealt them a blow, Corinne's pride was still intact, and pride like hers never dies quietly. She would come for us again, and when she did, I had to be ready. The neighborhood was quiet that evening, too quiet, as though everyone held their breath waiting for what came next. The ruling against the HOA had shaken the ground beneath Corinne's feet, but instead of retreating with dignity, she doubled down. Flyers were slipped under doors claiming my family had ruined the community. Whisper campaigns spread through backyard fences, painting us as troublemakers. Her pride was a beast, wounded but still hungry, still dangerous. But she had underestimated something. People had changed. The silence she once thrived on was gone. The neighbors who had once feared her now stood with us. Small acts at first, waves across the street, warm meals dropped at our porch, quiet apologies whispered to Emma. But soon their whispers turned into voices, and then into action. The HOA called for a final emergency meeting, Corinne desperate to reassert her control. She stood at the front of the hall, her voice sharp, declaring that our family had manipulated the court, that the judge had been biased, that outsiders didn't understand what it meant to protect property values. Her words cracked in the air like brittle glass. But this time the hall wasn't filled with silence and nods. It was filled with voices, angry, loud, and unafraid. An elderly man raised his hand, his voice trembling but firm. "You find me $200 every week for my wife's wheelchair ramp. Do you remember that, Corinne?" she cried every night. A young mother stood, holding her toddler on her hip. "You threatened to evict me because my child left chalk drawings on the sidewalk. I thought I was alone. Turns out you've done this to all of us." One by one, they rose. Their stories poured out like a flood. Years of fear, shame, and humiliation turned into a storm of truth. Corinne tried to shout over them, her voice shrill, her face red with fury, but every word she threw was drowned by the tidal wave of voices finally breaking free. And then Emma stood. She walked slowly to the front, her small frame trembling but her voice steady. "You tried to cancel my treatment," she said simply, her eyes locked on Corinne. "You said I wasn't worth it, but look around you. Everyone here is worth it. You don't get to decide that anymore." The room went silent. Silent except for the sound of Corinne's composure cracking. The HOA board, sensing the inevitable, called for a vote of no confidence. Neighbors raised their hands, one after another, then in groups, until nearly the entire hall was a forest of raised arms. Corinne's eyes darted wildly, her voice begging, threatening, pleading, but it was over. Her crown had crumbled. When the final count was read, she had been stripped of her title, her authority, and her grip on the community. But the humiliation didn't end there. A local reporter who had caught wind of the courthouse hearing had been present, recording every word. The next morning, her downfall was plastered across headlines. HOA president ousted after harassment scandal, families finally speak out. Her once pristine reputation was ashes. I watched from my porch as Corinne loaded boxes into her SUV, her face pale, her movements sharp and angry. She wouldn't look at anyone. Neighbors stood on sidewalks, some silent, some relieved, some even smiling. For years, she had been their nightmare. Today, she was just another bitter woman driving away. Emma sat beside me, a blanket around her shoulders. She didn't cheer, she didn't gloat, she simply whispered, "We can breathe now." I looked at her, at my mother, at my sister, and I realized the revenge wasn't the humiliation or even the justice. It was this moment. It was peace. It was the chance to rebuild without fear, to laugh in our own yard without glancing over our shoulders, to live again. That night, as we gathered around the dinner table for the first time in months, laughter returned. Real laughter. Emma's cheeks flushed with joy, my mother's eyes shone not with tears of grief but with light, and my sister leaned into me, whispering, "It's over." But I knew the truth. Revenge had never really been about destroying Corinne. It had been about protecting Emma, about proving that no one, not a neighbor, not a board, not even an entire system, had the right to take away her dignity, her treatment, her hope. As I held their hands that night, I knew we had won something far greater than a battle. We had reclaimed our lives. And Karen, she had lost everything she valued most: control, power, and the illusion of respect. That was the perfect ending. Not loud, not violent, but absolute. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't fire or fury. It's silence, peace, and the freedom to smile again without fear.